The crystalline walls of Nexus Station's supreme arbitration chamber reflected the nervous energy of a dozen alien species as they awaited what many considered the trial of the millennium. Phoenix Wright adjusted her simple black blazer a stark contrast to the elaborate ceremonial robes worn by the other advocates and reviewed her notes one final time. Counselor Wright, the Zephyrian clerk's voice resonated through specialized vocal translators. The tribunal questions your qualifications. For this proceeding, you represent a species barely 2 centuries into interstellar travel, yet you seek to challenge legal precedents established over 40,000 years of galactic civilization. Phoenix looked up from her tablet, her brown eyes meeting the clerk's compound optical array without flinching. Your Honor, I represent Kethfer of the Morning Cliffs, a Thraxian accused of violating the sacred laws of predetermined destiny. My qualifications aren't measured in the age of my species, but in my commitment to justice. A ripple of what could only be described as polite scoffing emanated from the gallery. The lead prosecutor, Magistrate Vorthak of the Hegemony, rose from his position, a towering figure whose exoskeleton gleamed with medals of jurisprudential achievement spanning 3 millennia. This tribunal recognizes the novelty of allowing a human advocate to participate in sacred law proceedings. Vorthak's voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. However, the case is elementary. The defendant chose to mate outside his predetermined genetic caste. The sentence is established: exile from all worlds and termination of bloodline privileges. These laws exist to maintain the natural order that has preserved galactic peace for 40 millennia. Phoenix stood, her movement causing several aliens to instinctively step back. Humans had a reputation for unpredictable behavior that made many species nervous. Your Honor, I'd like to present evidence that challenges the very foundation of these so-called natural laws. The chief arbiter, an ancient being whose species had transcended physical form eons ago, materialized more solidly above the central dais. Counselor Wright, these proceedings operate under established protocols. Evidence is predetermined based on caste genetics, generational records, and algorithmic destiny calculations. What could a human possibly add to 40,000 years of legal precedent? A story, Phoenix said simply. The chamber fell silent, except for the subtle hum of environmental systems calibrated for a dozen different atmospheric requirements. Even the translation matrices seemed to pause, uncertain how to process such an unexpected response. I beg your pardon? The chief arbiter's form flickered with what might have been confusion. Your Honor, with respect to this tribunal's incredible history and wisdom, I believe the entire foundation of galactic jurisprudence is built on a fundamental misunderstanding of what justice actually means. Phoenix's voice carried clearly through the chamber, her tone respectful but unwavering, and I can prove it with a story. Magistrate Vorthak's mandibles clicked in what his species expressed as aggressive dismissal. Honored tribunal, this is precisely why primitive species should not be granted advocacy privileges. Humans apparently confuse legal proceedings with entertainment. Stories aren't entertainment, Magistrate, Phoenix replied, turning to address him directly. They're how humans understand truth. And truth, I believe, should be the foundation of any legal system that claims to serve justice. The gallery erupted in a cacophony of alien voices, translation matrices struggling to keep up with expressions of outrage, confusion, and curiosity in 17 different languages. The chief arbiter's form blazed brighter, calling for order. Counselor Wright, the chief arbiter's voice carried undertones that suggested this was highly irregular. This tribunal has reviewed your species' legal traditions. Your adversarial system, with its emphasis on conflict and emotional manipulation, is precisely the kind of chaos that galactic civilization evolved beyond. Our system is based on predetermined outcomes that maintain stability across 10,000 worlds. But what if predetermined outcomes aren't actually just? Phoenix asked. What if they're just predetermined? The question hung in the crystalline air, like a challenge that none of the assembled beings had ever considered. For 40,000 years, galactic law had operated on the principle that justice was the inevitable result of following established patterns, that some beings were destined to rule, others to serve, and that challenging these patterns led only to chaos and war. Kethfer, the Thraxian defendant, looked up from his containment field for the first time since the proceedings began. His rocky features, carved with the deep grooves that marked his mining caste, showed something that his guards had never seen in a Thraxian facing sacred law violations. "Hope, Your Honor," Phoenix continued, "I request permission to present my case using human legal methodology, not to replace your system, but to offer a different perspective on what justice might look like when it's not predetermined." Magistrate Vorvik's exoskeleton literally bristled with indignation. "This is absurd. Human legal methodology? Their species resolves disputes through formalized combat disguised as trials. They allow untrained individuals to determine guilt or innocence based on emotional manipulation rather than scientific analysis of predetermined factors. We call them juries," Phoenix said with a slight smile. "And yes, they're not perfect, but they're also not predetermined. They listen to evidence, consider arguments, and make decisions based on what they believe is right, not what an algorithm calculated 40,000 years ago. The chief arbiter's form dimmed as it processed this concept. In galactic civilization, the idea that untrained individuals could determine legal outcomes was not just foreign, it was terrifying. Their entire system was built on the premise that only those specifically evolved or engineered for legal analysis could possibly understand the complex interplay of factors that determine justice. "Counselor Wright," the chief arbiter spoke slowly, "are you suggesting that random individuals with no legal training, no genetic predisposition for jurisprudential analysis, no access to the vast databases of precedent, are somehow better equipped to determine justice than our most advanced legal minds?" "I'm suggesting they might be the only ones who can see it clearly," Phoenix replied, "because they're not bound by precedent, genetic programming, or predetermined outcomes. They can look at a situation and ask a simple question. Is this right?" A low murmur ran through the gallery as universal translators struggled to convey the concept across species barriers. The idea that legal decisions could be based on such a subjective, unpredictable standard was simultaneously alien and somehow out intriguing. Cathfar's guard, a professional enforcement officer from the hegemony, found himself looking at the defendant differently. For the first time in his career, he wondered, was it right that this being should lose everything simply because he fell in love with someone from a different caste? "This tribunal will recess," the chief arbiter announced suddenly. "Counselor Wright, you will have one standard galactic day to prepare your unconventional defense. However, understand that if you fail to prove your methodology superior to 40 millennia of established law, the consequences will extend far beyond your client. This case will set precedent for whether primitive species may participate in galactic legal proceedings." As the chamber emptied, Phoenix remained at her table, reviewing her notes. She wasn't just defending Cathfar anymore, she was defending the idea that justice couldn't be calculated, only discovered. And she had less than 24 hours to figure out how to convince beings who had never questioned their system that there might be a better way. The stakes had just become galactic. Phoenix Wright's temporary quarters aboard Nexus Station offered a panoramic view of the disputed zone, a region of space where 3 different galactic civilizations maintained an uneasy peace through precisely the kind of predetermined legal framework she was now challenging. The irony wasn't lost on her. Her door chimed with the harmonic sequence indicating a Thraxian visitor. "Come in," she called, expecting to see Cathfar's family representative. Instead, an elderly Thraxian female entered, her rock-like features bearing the deep ceremonial scarification that marked her as a keeper of ancient ways. Phoenix had never seen one in person. Keepers rarely left their homeworlds and never involved themselves in legal proceedings. "Counselor Wright," the keeper's voice carried the resonant tones of someone who had spent centuries in deep meditation. "I am Farovs, keeper of the 7th Deep. I have come to ask you to abandon this case." Phoenix gestured to a chair, though she wasn't sure it would accommodate the keeper's massive frame. "With respect, Keeper Theros, I don't abandon my clients. This is not about abandonment." Farovs settled onto the floor instead, her presence somehow making the spacious quarters feel smaller. "This is about understanding consequences you cannot foresee. Do you know why the sacred laws of predetermined destiny exist? To maintain control," Phoenix replied without hesitation. To keep certain castes in power while others serve. No, the simple word carried such weight that Phoenix found herself sitting down. They exist because my people tried your way once. 7,000 years ago, Thraxian society operated on principles not unlike what you call justice. Individuals could choose their mates, their professions, their destinies. Do you know what happened? Phoenix remained silent, sensing this was not a rhetorical question. War, not the clean, honorable conflicts of territorial expansion, but civil war that consumed entire worlds. When beings believe they can determine their own destinies, they inevitably come into conflict with others attempting the same thing. The casualty toll was... Tharovs paused, her scarified features showing grief that at age 7 millennia, 47 billion Thraxians died. Counselor Wright, 47 billion souls lost because we believed in individual choice over predetermined harmony. The number hit Phoenix like a physical blow. Earth's entire population was barely 8 billion. The scope of loss was incomprehensible. So we chose stability. Tharovs continued. We accepted that some would sacrifice individual desires for a greater good. Kethver's punishment seems harsh to you, but it prevents the deaths of billions. How do you weigh one being's happiness against the potential for such catastrophe? Phoenix stared out at the stars, each one representing solar systems with their own histories of choice and consequence. Keeper, may I ask you something personal? You may ask, were you born into the Keeper caste? Or did you choose it? Tharov's silence stretched long enough that Phoenix wondered if she had given offense. Finally, I was bred for it. Selected from genetic lines optimized for long-term thinking and emotional stability. My destiny was determined before my hatching. Do you ever wonder what you might have chosen to be? Every day for 7 centuries. The admission came so quietly that Phoenix almost missed it. But my wonderings do not justify 47 billion deaths. Phoenix turned back to face the ancient being. What if there was a third option? What if choice and stability didn't have to be mutually exclusive? Impossible. This has been proven through mathematical modeling across dozens of species over 40 millennia. Has it? Or has it been assumed? Phoenix moved to her workstation, calling up files she'd been reviewing. Keeper, I've spent the last several hours studying galactic legal history. Do you know what I found? Tharovs remained silent, but her posture indicated attention. Every single major war, every collapse of civilization, every catastrophe that your legal system claims to prevent, they all have one thing in common. They weren't caused by individuals making choices. They were caused by systems that prevented individuals from making choices until the pressure became so great that it exploded into violence. Phoenix gestured to her display, showing historical data spanning millennia. The Cetacean Rebellion wasn't caused by too much freedom. It was caused by a caste system so rigid that an entire species was bred for menial labor without any hope of advancement. The Crystal Wars weren't caused by individual choice. They were caused by predetermined trade agreements that favored certain worlds over others, until the disadvantaged systems had no recourse but violence. You misunderstand the complexity. Do I? Phoenix interrupted gently. Or do I understand it differently? Keeper, what if the problem isn't that beings make bad choices when given freedom? What if the problem is that systems which deny choice eventually create situations where violence seems like the only choice left? Tharovs rose to her full height, her scarified features showing conflict. You suggest that 7,000 years of Thraxian peace, 40,000 years of galactic stability, the prevention of countless wars, all of this was wrong? I suggest it was incomplete, Phoenix said. You achieved peace by removing choice. But humans have a saying, peace is not merely the absence of war, but the presence of justice. What if true peace requires both stability and choice working together? Impossible philosophical speculation, is it? Because tomorrow, I'm going to prove it's not only possible, but necessary. Phoenix faced the Keeper directly. I'm going to show this tribunal that justice based on predetermined outcomes isn't justice at all. It's just control with better marketing. Tharovs moved toward the door, then paused. Counselor Wright, if you succeed in this case, you will not simply free Kethfor. You will begin the dismantling of the legal framework that has prevented galactic war for 40 millennia. Are you prepared for that responsibility? Keeper, if I fail in this case, I'll have failed more than just my client. I'll have failed the idea that beings deserve the right to determine their own destinies, even if those choices sometimes lead to mistakes. Phoenix met the ancient being's gaze. Are you prepared for the responsibility of denying that right for another 40,000 years? After Tharov's left, Phoenix stood alone in her quarters, looking out at the stars. Somewhere among them was Earth, where 8 billion humans continued their chaotic, unpredictable, often messy experiment in individual choice and collective responsibility. They weren't perfect, far from it, but they were free to try to be better about tomorrow. She would argue that freedom was worth the risk. The question was, could she convince beings who had spent millennia believing otherwise? Phoenix Wright entered the arbitration chamber to find it packed beyond capacity. Word of the human lawyer challenging 40 millennia of legal precedent had spread throughout Nexus Station, and representatives from dozens of species had come to witness what many were calling either a historic moment or an embarrassing spectacle. Counselor Wright, the chief arbiter, materialized with unusual intensity. This tribunal has spent considerable time reviewing human legal methodology. We find it chaotic, unpredictable, and based on questionable premises. However, we are prepared to observe your demonstration, if only to document its failure for future reference. Magistrate Vorthik stood at his position, his exoskeleton polished to mirror brightness. Honored Tribunal, before this proceeding begins, I must note that overnight analysis of human legal precedents reveals a success rate barely above random chance. Their adversarial system has produced documented cases of innocent beings punished and guilty ones freed, based purely on the emotional manipulation skills of their advocates. That's partially true, Phoenix acknowledged, causing surprised murmurs throughout the chamber. Human justice isn't perfect. We make mistakes, sometimes terrible ones. But there's something Magistrate Vorthik's analysis didn't capture. We learn from those mistakes. We have appeals processes. We overturn wrongful convictions. We constantly try to improve our system, because we recognize it's not infallible. She gestured to the assembled beings. Your system claims perfection based on predetermined outcomes. But perfect according to whom? 40,000 years ago, someone decided that certain beings should rule and others should serve. That some choices were acceptable and others forbidden. Those decisions became law, and those laws became sacred, and now questioning them is treated as heresy rather than progress. The chief arbiter's form flickered. Counselor Wright, you will present your defense of the accused or withdraw from these proceedings. Your Honor, my defense of Kethvar is inseparable from my challenge to this system, because the system itself is the real defendant here. Phoenix moved to the center of the chamber. This court operates on the premise that justice is predetermined, that by analyzing genetic markers, social castes, and algorithmic projections, you can determine the correct outcome of any legal dispute. But that's not justice. That's just ... bureaucracy with delusions of grandeur. The gallery erupted, but Phoenix continued over the noise. Kethvar stands accused of violating the sacred laws of predetermined destiny by choosing to mate outside his genetic caste. The prosecution argues this threatens galactic stability. I argue that laws preventing individuals from making personal choices are the real threat to stability. Magistrate Vorthik's mandibles clicked aggressively. Counselor Wright would have this tribunal ignore 40 millennia of peace, the prevention of countless wars, the stable societies that have flourished under predetermined law, all for her romantic notion of choice. Choice isn't romantic, Magistrate. It's practical. Phoenix activated her display, showing data she'd compiled through the night. I've analyzed your 40 millennia of peace. Do you know what I found? Peace for whom? Because while the ruling castes have enjoyed stability, I count over 300 species that have gone extinct, not through war or natural disaster, but through legal determination that their genetic lines were incompatible with galactic harmony. A shocked silence fell over the chamber. Even the environmental systems seemed to quiet. Those were necessary adjustments to prevent greater catastrophes, the chief arbiter said, but their usual certainty wavered. According to whom? Phoenix demanded. Who decided those species had to die? What appeals process existed? What review procedures? Or were they just predetermined sacrifices to maintain your version of order? She turned to address the gallery directly. 300 species, billions of individual beings who never got to choose their fate, never got to argue their case, never got to prove they deserved to exist. All because 40,000 years ago, someone decided that predetermined order was worth any price. Kethver looked up from his containment field, tears and emotion Thraxians rarely displayed publicly flowing down his rocky features. In the gallery, several beings were looking uncomfortable as Phoenix's words sank in. But this isn't just about the past, Phoenix continued. It's about the future. Kethver fell in love with Lyria of the Crystal Depths, a being from what your system classifies as an incompatible genetic line. Their children, should they have any, would represent genetic combinations that your algorithms can't predict or control. So your solution is to prevent their existence entirely. Magistrate Vorthik rose. The genetic incompatibility is scientifically verified. Their offspring would possess traits that could destabilize established social hierarchies. You mean their children might be individuals who don't fit neatly into predetermined castes? Phoenix smiled. Magistrate, you've just made my point. You're not preventing social catastrophe. You're preventing social evolution. She moved closer to the tribunal. Every being in this chamber is the product of evolutionary processes that thrived on genetic diversity, environmental adaptation, and yes, choice. Your ancestors chose to explore new worlds, chose to form interstellar civilizations, chose to work together despite their differences. But now you want to stop choosing, to lock the galaxy into patterns established millennia ago by beings who couldn't possibly have imagined the universe we live in today. The Chief Arbiter's form brightened. Counselor Wright, you speak of choice as though it's inherently positive. But choice also means the freedom to choose wrongly, to cause harm, to destabilize systems that protect billions. Yes, Phoenix said simply, it does. Choice is risky. Freedom is dangerous. Democracy is messy and unpredictable, and sometimes produces terrible results. But the alternative isn't safety, it's stagnation. And stagnation, over long enough periods, becomes its own form of death. She gestured toward Kethver. This being chose love over law, and you call that criminal. But I call it hopeful, because it means that after 7,000 years of predetermined destiny, Thraxians still possess the capacity to choose something new, something unexpected, something that might lead to growth rather than mere survival. And if that growth leads to chaos, to war? Tharovs had entered the chamber unannounced, her presence causing a stir among the gallery. Phoenix faced the Keeper directly. Then we deal with the chaos. We learn from the mistakes. We try to do better, but we don't prevent the attempt entirely, just because it might not work perfectly. She turned back to the tribunal. Your Honor, I'm not asking you to abandon all laws or dismiss the value of stability. I'm asking you to consider that true justice requires balancing stability with growth, order with freedom, predetermined safety with the possibility of something better. The Chief Arbiter's form dimmed as it processed this concept. Around the chamber, beings who had never questioned the fundamental assumptions of galactic law found themselves wondering, what if there was a better way? This tribunal will recess to consider these unconventional arguments, the Chief Arbiter announced. However, Counselor Wright, you have not yet provided a practical alternative to predetermined justice. Philosophy is insufficient. We require a functional system. As the tribunal withdrew, Phoenix looked around the chamber at faces and face analogs, showing expressions she'd never seen before in galactic legal proceedings. Curiosity, uncertainty, and something that might have been hope. She had planted the seeds of doubt in 40,000 years of assumed truth. Now she had to propose something to grow in its place. The hardest part was still coming when the arbitration chamber reconvened. Phoenix Wright noticed something unprecedented. Beings from the gallery had moved closer to the proceedings, abandoning the rigid seating hierarchies, the typically organized galactic legal observations by species, caste, and social standing. Somehow, her arguments had begun breaking down barriers that had stood for millennia. Counselor Wright, the Chief Arbiter, materialized with what seemed like reluctant curiosity. This tribunal has reviewed your philosophical arguments regarding choice and predetermined justice. However, you have not provided a practical alternative. How would you replace a system that has maintained galactic stability for 40,000 years? Phoenix looked around the chamber, noting the mix of skeptical and hopeful expressions across dozens of species. Your Honor, I propose we conduct an experiment right here, right now. Magistrate Vorthek's exoskeleton bristled. An experiment? This is a legal proceeding, not a laboratory, isn't it? Phoenix challenged. You're testing whether predetermined justice is superior to individual choice. I'm simply suggesting we test both methods on the same case and compare results. The Chief Arbiter's form flickered with interest. Elaborate. Your system has already determined Kethver's fate based on genetic analysis, caste requirements, and algorithmic projections. You've concluded he must be exiled and his bloodline privileges terminated. Phoenix gestured to the defendant. I propose we also determine his fate using human methodology, a jury of his peers, making a decision based on evidence and deliberation rather than predetermined factors. Impossible, Vorthek declared. Jury selection alone would take standard years. And who would qualify as peers to a Thraxian minor? Anyone willing to listen to the evidence and make a fair decision, Phoenix replied. And I propose we select them from beings already present in this chamber. The suggestion sent shocked murmurs through the gallery. The idea that random observers could participate in legal determinations was not just foreign, it was almost incomprehensible to species that had bred specific castes for legal analysis. Theros spoke from her position near the back. Counselor, right, you would have beings with no legal training, no genetic predisposition for jurisprudential analysis, no understanding of galactic law, determine the fate of one of my people? Keeper, I would have beings capable of recognizing right from wrong, make a decision based on justice rather than precedent. Phoenix faced the tribunal. Your Honor, are you willing to test whether 40,000 years of predetermined law produces better results than the simple question, is this right? The Chief Arbiter's form brightened and dimmed repeatedly, processing concepts that challenge the fundamental assumptions of galactic civilization. This proposal is highly irregular, unprecedented, potentially dangerous. So was interstellar travel, Phoenix pointed out. So was forming the first galactic councils. So was deciding that different species could coexist peacefully. Every advancement in galactic civilization came from someone being willing to try something unprecedented. A voice from the gallery spoke up, a young Zephyrian whose compound eyes showed the rapid processing patterns of intense thought. I volunteer. Gasps echoed through the chamber. Spontaneous participation in legal proceedings violated every protocol of galactic jurisprudence. As do I, added a cetacean representative, their aquatic mobility suit humming with emotion. And I came from a being Phoenix didn't recognize. Crystalline features reflecting the chamber's lights. Within minutes, dozens of beings had volunteered to participate in what they were already calling the democracy experiment. The Chief Arbiter's form flickered so rapidly, it became almost strobe-like. This is chaos, Magistrate Vorthek protested. Random beings cannot determine legal outcomes. They lack training, preparation, genetic compatibility for legal reasoning. They lack predetermined biases, Phoenix corrected, which might be exactly what justice requires. The Chief Arbiter materialized more solidly. Counselor Wright, if this tribunal agrees to your experiment, what guarantee do you offer that the results will be valid? The same guarantee your system offers. None, Phoenix said. Justice isn't about guarantees, Your Honor. It's about trying to do what's right and accepting responsibility for the consequences. And if the experimental jury reaches a different conclusion than our predetermined analysis, Phoenix took a deep breath. This was the moment that would determine not just Kethvor's fate, but potentially the future of galactic justice. Then we'll have proven that different methods can produce different results, and this tribunal will have to decide which method better serves the cause of justice. The chamber fell silent, except for the hum of environmental systems and the subtle sounds of dozens of different species, breathing, circulating, or maintaining their various life processes. For perhaps the first time in 40 millennia, the outcome of a galactic legal proceeding was genuinely uncertain. This tribunal will permit the experiment, the Chief Arbiter announced. with the understanding that its results are observational rather than legally binding. The predetermined verdict will stand regardless of the experimental outcome. It wasn't everything Phoenix had hoped for, but it was a start. Your Honor, I request 12 volunteers from different species to serve as an experimental jury. Their task will be to hear the same evidence presented to this tribunal and determine whether Kethfar's actions warrant the punishment prescribed by predetermined law. The selection process itself became a revelation. Instead of genetic analysis and caste compatibility reviews, Phoenix simply asked potential jurors whether they believed they could listen fairly to evidence and make a decision based on what they heard. The simplicity of the selection criteria baffled observers accustomed to complex eligibility algorithms. The chosen jury reflected a diversity that would have been impossible under traditional legal protocols. A young Zephyrian engineer, an elderly cetacean philosopher, a crystalline artist, a Thraxian merchant from a different caste than Kethvar, a human diplomat, a robotic intelligence, and 6 others representing species that had never participated in galactic legal proceedings. Honored jury, the chief arbiter addressed the unprecedented gathering. You will hear evidence regarding the case of Kethvar versus the sacred laws of predetermined destiny. Your task is to determine whether the accused's actions warrant the prescribed punishment. What followed was unlike anything in the recorded history of galactic jurisprudence. Instead of algorithmic analysis and predetermined precedents, the jury heard testimony from Kethvar about his love for Lyria, from genetic experts about caste compatibility, from social scientists about the risks of destabilizing established hierarchies, and from historians about the consequences of both rigid control and excessive freedom. But more importantly, they asked questions that had never occurred to legal professionals bred for jurisprudential analysis. Questions like, who gets hurt if Kethfor and Lyria have children? And what happens to love when it's made illegal? And why should genetic compatibility matter more than emotional compatibility? The jury deliberated for 6 hours an eternity by galactic legal standards, but barely a moment compared to the 40 millennia of predetermined precedent they were effectively challenging. When they returned, the chamber was packed with beings who had never before witnessed the spectacle of uncertain justice. The Zephyrian engineer, elected as forgery by her peers, stood to deliver their verdict. Her compound eyes swept the chamber, reflecting the lights of a dozen different technologies. We find, she began, her voice carrying through translation matrices to every being present, that love is not a crime. The chamber erupted. The chaos following the jury's verdict lasted for over an hour. Beings who had spent their entire existences accepting predetermined outcomes suddenly found themselves confronting the possibility that 12 random individuals had reached a different conclusion than 40 millennia of legal precedent. Order, the chief arbiter materialized at maximum intensity. This tribunal will have order. Phoenix Wright stood calmly at her position, watching species that had never experienced legal uncertainty struggle to process what they had witnessed. The experimental jury remained seated, their diverse faces showing expressions ranging from satisfaction to nervousness as they realized the magnitude of what they had just done. Magistrate Vorthik was literally vibrating with indignation. This demonstration proves nothing except that untrained beings reach conclusions based on emotion rather than logic. Love is not a crime. Love is irrelevant to legal proceedings. Legal determinations must be based on established precedent, genetic compatibility, social stability requirements, all of which, Phoenix interrupted, are just fancy ways of saying, because that's how we've always done it. She turned to address the gallery. For 40,000 years, you've been told that your legal system is perfect because it prevents chaos. But what we've seen today suggests that your system isn't preventing chaos, it's preventing choice. And there's a difference. The young Zephyrian juror stood. May I address the tribunal? The request was so unprecedented that the chief arbiter's form flickered uncertainly. In galactic legal tradition, only trained advocates and designated experts participated in proceedings. This is highly irregular, Vorthik protested. Jury members are not qualified to address legal proceedings. Neither was I, Phoenix pointed out, until you let me try. The chief arbiter made what might have been the equivalent of a sigh. The juror may speak, though this tribunal notes that such participation violates established protocols. The Zephyrian's compound eyes reflected the chamber lights as she processed her thoughts at visible speeds. Honored Tribunal, I am Zix Andra of the Spiral Reaches, third-level engineer in quantum containment systems. I have no legal training, no genetic predisposition for jurisprudential analysis, no formal education in galactic law. She paused, looking around the chamber. But I do know the difference between right and wrong. And when 12 beings from different species, with different backgrounds, different ways of thinking, all came to the same conclusion after hearing the same evidence, maybe that means something. It means untrained beings reach predictable, emotional conclusions. Vorthik dismissed. Does it? Zixandra challenged. Because we didn't agree on everything. We debated for hours. The cetacean philosopher thought genetic compatibility was important. The robotic intelligence calculated statistical risks. The human diplomat worried about setting precedents. We disagreed about almost every detail. Her voice grew stronger. But we all agreed on one thing. Punishing someone for love doesn't make society safer. It just makes society crueler. A murmur of agreement rippled through the gallery, unprecedented in galactic legal proceedings, where observer participation was strictly forbidden. Tharavs rose from her position. Juror Zixandra, you speak of love as though it exists in isolation, but individual choices create cascading effects. Kethfor's choice to mate outside his caste could inspire others to make similar choices. If enough beings abandon predetermined social structures, we risk the same chaos that consumed my world 7,000 years ago. Keeper, the elderly cetacean juror, spoke from his aquatic mobility suit. With great respect to your people's history, may I ask, how many Thraxians have violated caste mating laws in the past 1,000 years? Tharavs paused, clearly not expecting the question. The exact number is ... classified. Honored Tribunal, Phoenix interjected. I request access to those statistics. The statistics are restricted to prevent social destabilization, Vorthik replied quickly. Or to prevent embarrassment, Phoenix suggested, because I suspect those numbers show that predetermined destiny isn't as popular as this tribunal claims. The chief arbiter's form dimmed as internal processing reached unprecedented levels. This tribunal will review the requested statistics in closed session. Your Honor, the crystalline juror spoke, their voice creating harmonic resonances throughout the chamber. If the statistics support predetermined law, why not share them? If they prove the system works, wouldn't that strengthen the tribunal's position? The question hung in the crystalline air, like a challenge that none of the legal authorities seemed prepared to answer. For the first time in 40 millennia, galactic jurisprudence was being questioned by beings who had never been taught that questioning was impossible. Phoenix seized the moment. Your Honor, I propose a broader experiment. Instead of keeping the statistics secret, why not make them public? Let every being in galactic civilization see how well predetermined destiny actually works. If the system is as successful as claimed, transparency will only strengthen it. And if the statistics suggest problems, the chief arbiter asked, then maybe it's time to consider improvements. Phoenix replied, systems that can't withstand scrutiny probably shouldn't be making life and death decisions for entire civilizations. The chamber buzzed with conversations in dozens of languages as beings who had never questioned galactic legal authority found themselves wondering what other established truths might benefit from examination. This tribunal will recess for deliberation, the chief arbiter announced. However, we note that today's proceedings have raised questions that extend far beyond the case of one Thraxian miner. The implications of these alternative methodologies require careful consideration. As the official participants filed out, the experimental jury remained in the chamber, surrounded by curious observers asking questions about their deliberation process. The sight was unprecedented. Beings from across the galaxy engaging in spontaneous discussions about justice, choice, and the nature of law itself. Phoenix found herself approached by Kethvar's guard, the hegemony enforcement officer, who had maintained professional distance throughout the proceedings. Counselor Wright, the guard's translator, carried undertones of uncertainty. In my 3 centuries of service, I have never questioned whether our legal determinations were correct. They were simply ... predetermined. But today ... today you wondered whether they were right, Phoenix finished. Yes, and I find that wondering ... disturbing. But also, the guard struggled with concepts for which his language had no direct translations. ... necessary? Phoenix smiled. That's the beginning of critical thinking. It's uncomfortable at first, but it gets easier with practice. Is this how humans always approach legal questions? With uncertainty and experimentation? We approach everything that way, Phoenix admitted. It drives some species crazy, but it's also how we've survived situations that should have killed us, solved problems that should have been impossible, and created things that should never have worked. The guard's optical sensors focused on her with new intensity. Your species uses uncertainty as a tool. We use it as a reality check. The moment you become certain you have all the answers, you stop looking for better questions. Phoenix looked around the chamber, where unprecedented conversations were still taking place. Your legal system became certain 40,000 years ago, but the universe has changed since then. Maybe it's time for your laws to catch up. 3 days later, Nexus Station had transformed into something resembling a galactic forum rather than a judicial facility. Beings who had come to witness a routine legal proceeding found themselves staying to participate in discussions about justice, governance, and individual rights that hadn't taken place in millennia. The chief arbiter had called for additional experts. But instead of the usual genetic analysts and algorithmic processors, they were consulting philosophers, historians, and even artists whose perspectives had never been considered relevant to legal proceedings. Phoenix Wright entered the reassembled chamber to find it reconfigured. Instead of the rigid hierarchical arrangement that reflected galactic legal tradition, the seating had been reorganized into a circular pattern that allowed all participants to see each other as equals. Counselor Wright, the chief arbiter, materialized with what seemed like reluctant respect. This tribunal has spent considerable time analyzing the statistics you requested. The results are ... illuminating. Magistrate Vorthik looked distinctly uncomfortable as a holographic display activated, showing data that had been classified for millennia. Over the past 1,000 years, the chief arbiter continued, there have been 847,392 documented violations of predetermined destiny laws across all member species. These violations have resulted in exactly 0 cases of social collapse, civilizational decline, or large-scale conflict. The number hit the chamber like a shockwave. Nearly 1 million beings had chosen individual destiny over predetermined law, and the galactic civilization had not only survived, but continued to thrive. Furthermore, the display updated with new information. Statistical analysis indicates that worlds with higher rates of predetermined destiny violations show increased innovation, artistic achievement, and technological advancement compared to worlds with strict adherence to caste requirements. Phoenix felt vindicated, but also sad. How many millions of beings had lived constrained lives, believing their sacrifices were necessary for galactic stability, when the evidence suggested the opposite? However, Vorthik interjected desperately. Correlation does not imply causation. These statistics do not prove that abandoning predetermined destiny improves civilization. You're right, Phoenix agreed, surprising him. They don't prove it, but they do prove that your system's fundamental justification, that individual choice leads to chaos, is demonstrably false. She turned to address the full chamber. For 40,000 years, you've been told that freedom is dangerous. That choice leads to catastrophe, that individual desires must be sacrificed for collective stability. But the evidence shows that beings who chose their own paths didn't destroy civilization. They improved it. Tharav spoke from her position, her ancient voice carrying the weight of millennia. Counselor Wright, statistics cannot capture the full complexity of social systems. Even if recent violations have not caused immediate chaos, we cannot predict the cumulative effects of abandoning established order. Keeper, with deep respect for your experience, That argument could justify never changing anything, ever. Phoenix looked around the chamber at faces representing dozens of species. Each evolved through countless adaptations to changing circumstances. Every being in this chamber is the product of evolutionary processes that require change, adaptation, and yes, risk. Why should social evolution be any different? The young Zephyrian juror, Zixandra, raised an appendage. May I share something from our deliberations? The chief arbiter's form brightened. The jury's internal discussions were not intended for public. Please, Phoenix interrupted. If we're truly examining different approaches to justice, shouldn't transparency be part of the process? After a moment's hesitation, the chief arbiter agreed. Zixandra stood, her compound eyes reflecting the chamber's lights. During our deliberations, the robotic intelligence on our jury, Unit 7749, made an observation that I found profound. Unit 7749, would you share it? The robotic juror's optical sensors glowed as it accessed its memory banks. I observed that the concept of predetermined destiny contains a logical contradiction. If destiny is truly predetermined, then violations should be impossible. The fact that beings can and do violate these laws suggests that they are not natural laws at all, but artificial constraints. The observation sent murmurs through the chamber as beings processed its implications. Unit 7749 continued. Furthermore, I calculated that a system claiming to prevent chaos while requiring constant enforcement to maintain order is not preventing chaos, it is suppressing it. Suppressed chaos does not disappear. It accumulates until it finds expression, often in more destructive forms than would have occurred with gradual adaptation. Phoenix felt a surge of gratitude toward the artificial intelligence. Its purely logical analysis had reached the same conclusion as her emotional and philosophical arguments, but from a completely different direction. Unit 7749 raises an important point, she said. Your system doesn't prevent chaos, it postpones it. And the longer you postpone it, the more explosive it becomes when it finally arrives. Magistrate Vorthic's exoskeleton clicked aggressively. These are theoretical speculations with no basis in established jurisprudence. Then let's establish new jurisprudence, Phoenix challenged. Your Honor, I formally request that this tribunal not only free Kethfer, but establish a new legal precedent, the right of all beings to self-determination, subject only to restrictions that prevent direct harm to others. The chamber fell silent. What Phoenix was proposing wasn't just a legal decision, it was a fundamental restructuring of galactic civilization. Counselor Wright, the chief arbiter's form, flickered with what might have been uncertainty. You are asking this tribunal to overturn 40,000 years of established law based on a 3-day experiment. I'm asking you to recognize 40,000 years of accumulated evidence that your established law doesn't work as advertised. Phoenix replied. The statistics you've shown, the testimony we've heard, the successful deliberations of an unprecedented jury, all of it points to the same conclusion. Beings are capable of making good decisions when given the freedom and information to do so. She looked around the chamber at faces showing expressions ranging from fear to excitement to hope. Your Honor, the question isn't whether change is risky. The question is whether the status quo is sustainable, because the evidence suggests it's not. Tharavs rose to her full height. Counselor Wright, if this tribunal accepts your proposal, what guarantee can you offer that the resulting changes won't lead to the same catastrophes we sought to prevent? Phoenix met the Keeper's gaze directly. The same guarantee that every pioneer, every explorer, every being who has ever tried to build something better has offered. None. But I can offer something your system can't. The promise that if we make mistakes, we'll acknowledge them, learn from them, and try to do better. She gestured toward Kethfer, still waiting in his containment field. This being chose love over law. Instead of punishing him for that choice, why not celebrate the fact that after 7,000 years of predetermined destiny, Phyrexians are still capable of choosing hope over habit? The chief arbiter's form dimmed as processing reached unprecedented levels. Around the chamber, beings who had never imagined questioning fundamental assumptions of galactic civilization found themselves contemplating possibilities they had never been allowed to consider. This tribunal will deliberate, the chief arbiter announced. However, We note that the decision we make today will establish precedent that affects every being in galactic civilization. The weight of that responsibility is exactly why it shouldn't be made by predetermined algorithm. Phoenix finished. It should be made by beings willing to accept responsibility for the consequences of their choices. As the tribunal withdrew for deliberation, the chamber remained active with conversations that would have been unthinkable days earlier. Beings from different species, castes, and social levels were discussing justice, freedom, and responsibility as equals. The revolution had already begun. The only question was whether it would be officially recognized. When the arbitration chamber reconvened for the final time, it was to witness something unprecedented in galactic legal history, a tribunal uncertain of its decision. The chief arbiter materialized with unusual hesitancy, their form flickering between states as internal processing struggled with concepts that challenged the fundamental architecture of galactic jurisprudence. This tribunal has completed its deliberations, they announced, though we note that the process itself has been transformative. For 40,000 years, our decisions have been predetermined by established precedent, genetic analysis, and algorithmic certainty. Today, for the first time, we have experienced what humans call uncertainty. Phoenix Wright stood at her position, aware that the next few minutes would determine not just Cuthbert's fate, but the future direction of galactic civilization. We find, the chief arbiter continued, that the evidence presented challenges, fundamental assumptions about justice, order, and the nature of law itself. The experimental jury's deliberations, the statistical analysis of predetermined destiny violations, and the philosophical arguments regarding individual choice have convinced this tribunal that our current system may be incomplete. Gasps echoed through the chamber. A tribunal admitting fallibility was beyond unprecedented. It was revolutionary. Magistrate Vorthic's exoskeleton rattled with barely contained protest. Honored tribunal, surely you cannot be considering overturning 40 millennia of legal precedent based on philosophical speculation and emotional manipulation. We are considering, the chief arbiter replied, the possibility that 40 millennia of legal precedent may have been based on false assumptions about the nature of justice and the capabilities of individual beings to make responsible choices. The chief arbiter's form solidified with new resolve. In the matter of Kethvar versus the sacred laws of predetermined destiny, this tribunal finds the accused not guilty of any crime that serves the cause of justice. The chamber erupted in ways that no translation matrix could adequately process. Beings who had never experienced legal uncertainty suddenly found themselves witnessing its resolution in favor of individual choice over systemic control. Furthermore, the chief arbiter continued over the noise. This tribunal establishes the following precedent. No being shall be punished for choices that cause no direct harm to others, regardless of predetermined social requirements or genetic compatibility algorithms. Phoenix felt tears she hadn't realized she was shedding. It was more than she had dared hope for, not just freedom for her client, but recognition of the principle that had driven her across the galaxy to this moment. But the chief arbiter wasn't finished. However, this tribunal also recognizes that implementing such precedent across galactic civilization requires careful consideration of existing social structures, cultural traditions, and species-specific requirements. Therefore, we establish a transition period during which individual worlds and systems may adapt these principles according to their unique circumstances. It wasn't perfect, Phoenix realized, but it was progress. And progress, she had learned, was often more valuable than perfection. Kethver's containment field deactivated with a harmonic chime that seemed to resonate through the chamber. For the first time in months, the Thraxian miner stood free, his rock-like features showing emotions that his species rarely displayed publicly. Counselor Wright, he said, his deep voice carrying through the translation matrix. How do I thank someone who has given me not just freedom, but the right to choose my own destiny? You live it, Phoenix replied. You make choices, take responsibility for their consequences, and show the galaxy that freedom and responsibility can coexist. Therovs approached the freed prisoner, her ancient features showing conflict between millennia of conditioning and new possibilities. Kethver of the deep reaches, your choice has changed more than your own destiny. It has changed the destiny of our entire species. Keeper, Kethver replied with deep respect. Perhaps it's time our species remembered that we once chose our own path among the stars. Maybe it's time we started choosing again. The exchange was witnessed by beings from across the galaxy, many of whom were already planning to return to their homeworlds with stories of unprecedented legal precedent and the possibility of self-determination. As the formal proceedings concluded, Phoenix found herself surrounded by beings asking questions about human legal methodology, jury deliberation, and the practical implementation of individual choice within stable societies. The revolution in galactic jurisprudence was spreading faster than any predetermined algorithm could have calculated. Counselor Wright, Zixandra approached with her characteristic rapid optical processing. I've been authorized by my world's council to ask, would you be willing to consult on legal reforms for the Zephyrian reaches? Similar requests came from dozens of other beings, representing worlds across galactic civilization that had witnessed the proceedings and wanted to explore alternatives to predetermined destiny. I'm honored by your requests, Phoenix replied, but I think you're missing the point. You don't need me to reform your legal systems. You need to trust yourselves to make those reforms based on your own values, experiences, and hopes for the future. She looked around the chamber at faces showing expressions of possibility that hadn't been seen in galactic civilization for millennia. The jury that deliberated on Kethva's case didn't need special training or genetic predisposition for legal analysis. They just needed the willingness to listen, think, and take responsibility for their decision. Every being here has those capabilities. Unit 7749's optical sensors focused on her with mechanical precision. Counselor Wright, statistical analysis suggests that widespread adoption of choice-based legal systems will result in significant social disruption as established hierarchies adapt to new paradigms. You're probably right, Phoenix agreed. Change is disruptive, but stagnation is deadly. And after 40,000 years of predetermined destiny, I'd say galactic civilization is overdue for some healthy disruption. As beings began filing out of the chamber, many stopping to continue conversations that would have been impossible under the old system, Phoenix realized that her work here was complete. She had come to defend one client and ended up challenging an entire civilization to reconsider its fundamental assumptions about justice and individual rights. The ripple effects would spread across the galaxy for generations to come. 6 months after what historians would call the preceding wars, Phoenix Wright stood on the observation deck of her transport ship, watching Nexus Station recede into the star-scattered darkness. The facility had been transformed from a rigid judicial center into something resembling a galactic forum, where beings from across civilized space came to discuss, debate, and develop new approaches to justice and governance. Her personal communicator chimed with an update from the Galactic Legal Reform Network, an organization that hadn't existed before her case, but now coordinated legal innovations across hundreds of worlds. The latest report showed that 47 star systems had implemented some form of jury-based justice. 23 worlds had abolished caste-based legal restrictions, and countless others were experimenting with hybrid systems that balanced individual choice with social stability. Not all the changes had been smooth. 3 worlds had experienced significant social upheaval as established hierarchies adapted to new paradigms. But notably, none of the predicted catastrophes had materialized. Instead, most worlds reported increased innovation, artistic achievement, and citizen satisfaction. A message materialized in her quarters display, a holographic projection from Kethfor and Lyria, now legally mated and expecting their first child. Their offspring would grow up in a galaxy where genetic compatibility mattered less than emotional compatibility, where predetermined destiny was being replaced by chosen possibility. Counselor Wright, Kethfor's image said, Lyria and I wanted you to know that we've established a legal aid center on Thraxis Prime. We're helping other beings who want to challenge predetermined restrictions on their choices. We call it the Phoenix Center. Phoenix smiled, touched by the honor, but also pleased that they were taking responsibility for continuing the work rather than depending on her to do it for them. Not another message followed from Zixandra, now serving as the first elected chief justice of the Zephyrian reaches, a position that hadn't existed under their previous system, but had become necessary as they transitioned to choice-based governance. Phoenix, the young engineer's message, bubbled with excitement. Our first citizen jury just ruled on a trade dispute that had been deadlocked in traditional arbitration for 6 years. The solution they developed was so innovative that both parties are now considering expanding their partnership. Who would have thought that letting ordinary beings make legal decisions could produce extraordinary results? Perhaps most surprisingly, a message had arrived from Tharos, the ancient keeper who had initially opposed everything Phoenix represented. Counselor Wright, the keeper's image carried gravitas earned through centuries of experience. I wanted to inform you that the Council of Keepers has voted to begin the gradual dissolution of predetermined caste restrictions on Thraxis. The process will take decades and require careful management, but we have concluded that social evolution is preferable to social stagnation. This change would not have been possible without your demonstration that individual choice and collective stability are not mutually exclusive. Phoenix settled into her cabin's chair, reviewing reports from across the galaxy that documented the ongoing transformation of galactic civilization. The changes weren't uniform or universally successful, but they were authentically chosen by the beings who would live with their consequences. Her door chimed with the harmonic pattern indicating a human visitor. "Come in," she called. Captain Marcus Chan entered, a transport pilot whose reputation for finding creative solutions to impossible problems had made him Phoenix's preferred choice for interstellar travel. "Phoenix, we're receiving priority communications from 17 different star systems requesting legal consultation. Apparently, word of your work has spread beyond official channels." "What kind of cases?" Phoenix asked, though she suspected she already knew. "The usual," Marcus grinned. "Beings who've been told their dreams are impossible. Their choices are predetermined. Their destinies are fixed." "Sound familiar?" Phoenix looked out at the stars, each one representing solar systems where beings were discovering that they had more choices than they'd been told, more potential than they'd been allowed to explore, more hope than they'd been permitted to feel. "Set course for the Andorian Collective," she decided. "I have a feeling they're about to learn that impossible is just another word, for no one has tried the right approach yet." As their ship turned toward new challenges and unprecedented possibilities, Phoenix Wright reflected on the transformation she had witnessed. Galactic civilization hadn't collapsed when beings were given the freedom to choose their own destinies. Instead, it had begun to flourish in ways that no predetermined algorithm could have calculated. The revolution was spreading, one choice at a time, and Phoenix Wright, attorney at law, defender of the impossible, and accidental catalyst for galactic legal reform, was ready to help write the next chapter of a universe, finally learning that justice wasn't something to be calculated. It was something to be chosen again and again by beings willing to take responsibility for creating a better tomorrow. The precedent had been set. The future was unwritten. And that, Phoenix realized, was exactly as it should be.